Come on in, come on in. Welcome, everyone. I like it. Drinks in the auditorium. Nice. Have a seat. Welcome. It's really a fantastic pleasure to welcome Jing Liu and Florian IDENBURG this evening to present the work of their practice, So Ill. I think it's fair to say that So Ill is one of the most original voices emerging amongst the new generation of architects. There are many characteristics that set their work and approach apart from others, but one interesting and important way to enter this specificity and to understand it is, I believe, to take a moment to reflect on who they are and how and where they practice. First is the fact that So Ill doesn't easily fit in any predefined category. They don't exactly belong to a generation, since they are actually younger than the generation they have come to be associated with. At the same time, they seem already older than that generation if one is to look at the extensive work the practice has already produced, and especially the caliber of architectural competitions they have been invited to partake in nationally and internationally, often competing against leading architects from around the world, most recently AMALE, Rem Koolhaas, and Sana, as well as Annabelle Seldorf for the new museum expansion competition here in New York. Second, there's the sense that So Ill doesn't easily fit in a place. The partners call themselves Brooklyn architects rather than New York architects. The practice was founded in the US, even if it is, in their own words, quote, un-American, as if choosing to start a firm here as if they chose to start a firm here almost by accident. They speak of registering our contemporary and global condition not as something to be analyzed from a certain outside, but rather as a very personal experience of three partners whose backgrounds, native languages, and architectural formations could not be more different. They speak of searching for universal language at the intersection of or beyond those differences, but designed for ambiguity and an infinitude of meanings and destabilizations, at times very literal destabilizations, such as with their groundbreaking pole dance project, winner of the 2010 Young Architect Program competition at MoMA. Their work is intensely experiential, present, and material, while also being immensely reflective, ethereal, porous, and with a lightness that renders it, if not absent, then almost boundless. In many ways, So Ill's practice and work holds things together. Contradictions, hesitations, temporary and permanent, solid and air, the seemingly simple and the infinitely complex, the atmospheric and dreamy and the intently precise and concrete, the formal and the informal, form and performance. More importantly even, So Ill brings together ideas and buildings in a kind of choreography, at once logical and intuitive, while also always being in search of beauty as an intrinsic, fundamental, and indispensable ingredient of architecture. Much of this sense of perfectly imperfect equilibrium that So Ill's work embodies so well has been captured and rendered tangible in the practice's recent book, Order, Edge, Aura. With it, as with their work, we are moved from small to large moments and experiences, textures and affects, framed details, and streams of consciousness. In it, it is not only the fragments of materiality, transparency, reflectivity, solidity, or ethereality that are surprising and compelling, but also the words and stories which seem to perfectly echo the sense of So Ill's constructed parallel universe, one in which we are invited to enter and encouraged to engage. Florian IDENBURG and Jing Liu co-founded So Ill in 2008. Florian holds a Master of Science in Architecture from Delft University of Technology, and Jing studied in China, Japan, the UK, and the US before concluding with a Master's of Architecture from the Tulane School of Architecture in New Orleans. Since the firm's inception, Elias Papageorgiou has been a key member of the team and was made third partner in 2013. A native of Athens, he holds a Diploma of Architecture from Aristotle University in Greece and a Master's of Architecture from Harvard GSD, we're actually really thrilled to have two of the So Ill partners as part of the school, with Elias currently teaching at in the Core 1 first semester program of the MARC, and Jing teaching leading studios, advanced studios, since 2009. Their most notable projects to date include the Manetti Shrem Museum of Art at the University of California in Davis, Kuki Gallery in Seoul, Korea, the Logan offices, pole dance at MoMA PS1, Blueprint at the Storefront for Art and Architecture, and Breathe, Mini Living, a housing prototype which responds to the challenges of future urban living. The practice has been recognized with numerous awards, too numerous to say here today, but for both architecture and design, and they include an AIA San Francisco Merit Award, the PA Award, the Architecture League Emerging Voices Award, and the MoMA PS1 Young Architect Program Award, amongst others. The firm's work is included in the permanent collections of institutions such as MoMA, the Art Institute of Chicago, and the Carnegie Museum of Art. Please join me in welcoming Jing and Florian of So Ill.
Okay, thank you, AMALE. I realized that AMALE and us, we have known each other for more than a decade, and that's probably the reason why her introduction was one of the most accurate and precise, and somehow and the introduction really touches on a lot of the sentiment and the frameworks that we've been working in. Before I start to talk about anything, a little bit of a marketing campaign. The book is available on the on sale in the corridor and also on Amazon, and it just came out a few months ago, but we have a little bit of logistic distribution problems, so I think get it before you cannot anymore. So the book is a culmination of our work in the last 8 years that we had our office. And it took us 2 years to write every single word that's included in this book. Indeed, as AMALE mentioned, that we're 3 very different people, including many others that work in our office. Elias is from Athens, Florian from Holland, Amsterdam, near Amsterdam, and I'm from Nanjing, China. Once, I forget which movie I heard it in, but one of the quote in that I heard that resonate very well with our working style in the office is that, you know, the highest level of intelligence is able to hold 2 contradictory and extremely different ideas in the same place. So this is how we work. We argue all the time, and we contradict each other all the time, and that's why this book took many years to conceive. It would be really nice if you can be part of this journey as well. I put a lot of another. Okay, I just came back from. Actually, I'm curious because I know that we had an open house today here. And how many people are still in high school and came for open found? Well, sorry, undergrads. Sorry, undergrads. Oh, a few. Okay. No, I was just in London on Friday judging the RIBA medal for this part 2, so postgraduate, master degree projects from all over the world. And I saw 300-something portfolios in a very short period of time. And I realized that although I've been teaching at the school and, you know, your generation for a while, that the sentiment of the generation that that's sitting here has shifted so much all around the world, and it's really there is this of course the pervasive post-human contemplation that's I think that's going on at this moment, and also this either it's a dystopian or completely kind of a craft-oriented approach, holding on to some kind of humanities that, if it still exists today. So I kind of reflected a little bit based on my Friday's experience on this lecture's theme, which consists of two parts. I'm going to talk about the living parts, and Florian's going to talk about the matter parts. Since the beginning, this is actually a movie, Tarkovsky's movie, that we used as the prompt of our first Columbia studio 10 years ago, which was exactly to contemplate what it would be in a post-human society or world where our environment gets vaster and vaster, but our existence as human beings gets smaller and smaller. And on my way back from London, I also watched this movie. I don't know, many of you probably have watched it. I think the movie Blade Runner, when I went to school, was very much the movie to watch back then, and I think now it's coming full circles. As we're thinking about contemplating about the technology's implication on our society and how we're all getting faster and racing to a faster speed of connecting everything that we can consume, and things are getting more and more immaterial. The fact is that one that overlaps on the idiosyncrasy of the physical environment in the world, they take on edges, orders, changes, and also they become very vulnerable at moments. And when we zoom into this strange moments of the materials coming together in these small scales, they can be sometimes ridiculous in a humorous way, but also in this incredibly tragic way. So in the book, we contemplate on how do we then establish a new kind of order that maybe is different, a departure from the modernist way of understanding the order. Maybe things are a little bit more elastic and taking risk and the instability as a new form of joy and aesthetics, new aesthetics, and also making some kind of edge that's more permeable, and maybe it's an edge where they're lying on the outside of a form that you cannot draw with a single stroke, or it's an aura of a person or a being that's in the city that emanates some kind of universal feelings. So those are the things that we constantly talk about in the studios. And it all goes back to often the type or the discussion of how do we want to live as human beings as long as we're still here. I have been personally quite interested in, because I'm coming from a post-communist China, so the physical environment often is, I remember growing up still quite collective and quite planned and regulated. I became quite interested in the story of living, how it developed in the last century all around the world. And I came upon this book, which I'm quite surprised that not many people know about, but it's by Melusina Faye Pierce, who was, now a lot of people call them material feminists. At that moment, they were called Marxist feminists. And she wrote this book called Cooperative Housekeeping, which was pretty much the first kind of group of people that contemplated in the industrial cities how the technology and the new density in the cities is able to provide a new kind of way of living. And in the master plan sense, that collective housework can be taken outside of the realm of the domestic space, and and the typologies of collective kitchen and the daycare started to come into play as something of a new kind of urban typologies. So the kitchen becomes also a shared socialized space from then, and the daycare, as I mentioned. And at some point, as we reflect back, that why did that not happen, and why did the kitchen becomes, and all this new technology becomes something that we all have in our private space, is a curious moment in history. I think the American culture and the communist and socialist culture diverged, is where the consumerism as the driving force of our economical life became the driver after the recession in the 30s. And fast forward to how that created very intensely individualistic and also siloed, private lives are depicted in later movies like The Playtime of Jack T. And to today, the field of depths becoming shallower and shallower with the newer versions of technologies were intensely reflected and mirrored back onto ourselves. So how can we, not that, I'm proposing that we go back to the socialist and communist, narrative before the divergence, but it's really interesting to reflect on that 100 years of history of living, and through that lens, look at some of the places that we're working. And this is North Omaha. It's one of the sites that we're working currently at this moment on the collective artist loft project. It was a very vibrant, predominantly black neighborhood. In the 1960s, it was so highly regarded as the jazz center that there was a saying that if you didn't play North Omaha, you cannot be considered a jazz musician. And through a series of the investments, political and environmental issues, today it's one of the poorest neighborhoods in America. And so the project that we're working on is to try to use housing as a type, as a kind of urban type to regenerate the economical and cultural life in the city, which we will talk about. I don't think we're going to talk about it today, but just to give you a context. And this is another site that we're working in today, which is Leon in Mexico. In the last 20 years, in the kind of effort of home ownership and also urban development, there's this very fastly made cookie cutter house that's made basically blanketing the outskirts, the periphery of the urban centers. As you can see, they're built in a really more kind of product-oriented way. There's no not much social space, not so much infrastructure that's put in place. Often it's lacking transportation availabilities as well. So the city realized that rather than this kind of the relentless occupation of the peripheral space, it's better to environmentally and also community socially, it's better to re-densify the city core. So we're working with the city to consider more mid-rise housing typologies that is based on co-living and collective living, which I will talk about a little bit later. And this is one of the earliest projects that is in Athens, Greece. We didn't realize this project based because of the financial crisis in 2008 and the aftermath of that, but it's also one of those urban, dilapidated urban core that's seeking a new model of regeneration through the typology of the housing, which I will talk a little bit about. So this is the neighborhood in Athens. And so there are a lot of empty lots that's just by virtue left empty because of the lack of maintenance and development and the new interest in new residents. And they're all left empty, and you can see a lot of conditions that's half taken over by nature and half kind of architecture rebels. And instead of the building just as infill, passive infill typologies, we took the same building massing and turned it to the sideways, and used it more as almost a barcode to connect the empty lots throughout the entire neighborhood. So we called it the party wall as the typologies. So the buildings are super skinny. They are so skinny that you can almost not call it a building, but they just occupy half of, sometimes even less than half of the building, the site width. And by squeezing the interior space as much as possible and releasing the exterior space as much as possible, we were able to use it as more of an urban operation to make this very dense blocks that's deteriorating and dilapidated into something active again. So this was the hope of the urban operation. In the end, that there would be this barcode of multiple colors and different lives that injects and kind of cuts new energies into the city. So it's more of a typological studies rather than building studies for this project. And we continued similar. This was 2007, I think it was the project. It's one of the first competition we entered, thanks to Elias here, that we were able to understand the specific conditions in the neighborhood. And then we took the similar idea and participated in the competitions of I think it's called a micro housing that Mayor Bloomberg, the last mayor of New York, put out, which is to also, in a way, densify the already quite dense New York city blocks, but there are a lot of unbuilt or not underused FAR left in some of this tower in the park. Modernist housing blocks. So we used, again, an architecture as an urban strategy to re-establish that street edge. So we pushed the building onto the edge of the block, whereas all the other buildings are this tower in the park typologies that's pushed into the center of the lot. And try to find a way to make this unit, again, as small as possible within the building code regulations. So in the end, I think the building, the lot was 230 square feet. The site. No, I think the whole unit, yeah, the whole unit was like 225 or something square foot. And so it's really the most essential things that's related to living that's grouped in here for all the personal and the most private functions of the living. And then similarly, rather than kind of overloading the corridors, which is the common space in the middle, and doing this double loaded corridor that only gets light from one side, and inevitably you get light of the north for the half of the building, we made it into a double corridor and single unit building. So you would have the living space right in the middle, but the common circulation are both in the front and the back. So actually maximizing the common space and minimizing the private space. This was the unit plan, quite simple. And again, the top and the bottom, the front and the back, that they all become this common space that the private life is pushed out to establish this more communal and socialized space. And because of the this squishing of the middle, the building becomes almost translucent when you are looking from the building next door, that you can almost see through the building. That was our hope. And Mimic and Eric won. I think Eric is here in the back. And I think we had a very different approach, but I'm very glad that you were the one doing it. So this is a Lyon project that started with a very dynamic discussion with the city stakeholders, the banks, the loan providers in the city, and talking mostly about what should we do with the city that we have as a physical space. Sorry. And also, how can we change the people's mentality of that we all have to own something on the land that actually doesn't have any social infrastructures, but somehow that land belongs to you, which is an idea that has already been planted so deeply in people's mind, and to change that preference to something that's the opposite. You know, like you don't, maybe the land is more shared and it's common, and the corridor is more common, but somehow the quality of life and it's a different way of understanding life, and how can we shift the value proposition for the people who are who we're trying to move back to the city core. So coming out of that workshop, the similar typologies that we have been always advocating also took a different kind of turn in this one. Similarly, rather than the double-loaded corridors, we used a single-loaded corridor building, but also changed it, twisted in an 8-shape Möbius shape building form, so that the common corridor is both outside and inside in the building in different locations. And when it goes to inside, it also linked together abundance of shared space inside of the building. And instead of a very regular facade, we tried to devise a very simple but repeated facade type that is using this scallop to create an infinitely varied facade type in the building that also gives different width of openings that look connected to inside and outside. The building is 62 units for $1.2 million construction cost, so it's a super low cost building. But I think the aim here was not so much in architecture as an object, but really as using architecture as an agency to change a certain way of connecting with each other and with the city itself. So that's going to be started by the end of this year, right? Yeah. And this was so we keep trying with a new kind of way of talking about the living. And I feel that in the last 2-3 years, we finally gotten some more tractions with our desires and aims. And this was one of the other successful stories as well. And I think that's really because the common kind of discussion has started to change in how we live in the cities all around the world already. And this is one of the Reinventing Paris is a new competition that was launched by the current mayor in Paris that kind of encourages interdisciplinary collaborations between different experts, also city officials and sociologists and basically, and also like users, program users together and developers together come up with propositions for some of the most problematic public sites in Paris. The current edition is looking at underground sites in Paris and how can we come up with innovative idea to occupy them. And our sites, our edition was along the river Seine, and the sites that we participated in was this corridor from the Bastille dead kind of hitting into the river, and it created this site that, in a way, could be very heightened moment of these two important axes, but looking very closely to it, there's this incredible, difficult to trespass elevation change with the highway and the water being low and the streets, the city streets being high. So it's actually a very, very disconnected relationship between the canal and the river at this edge. The natural instinct would be to make something big and become this heightened moment at the crossing of this two axes. But counterintuitively, we decided to, instead of blocking and creating something very wow at that moment, to create something super low and make the building mass on the side of the axis. So this is a very low-rise co-working space that we put on our site. And the aim of that volume is not so much about an architectural statement, but it's really to activate that edge and populate it. And the housing part, the very small housing part, is the economical vehicle to make that happen. And the idea is that this place would be changed over time through different phases. We first activated the streets with this co-working and also quite a public rooftop here. And then over time, when this edge, it's later, okay. I wanted to show this picture. Over time, when this edge become activated and urbanistically, it's transformed in the neighborhood and in the people's mind, and maybe the highway can be, it can also play an active role in promoting the highway to be transformed from a vehicular space to a public space, thanks to the autonomous vehicles that's going to happen very soon, that we can give the city back this piece of land, because we're only going to lease it for 15 years, and then we can give it back to the land, to the city, and therefore the people, and reconceive what this place can be. So using architecture as more of a way of thinking the transformation of the city, rather than an object that is set in the stone. So I'm just going to show you a little bit of the housing part, which is also a co-living space, which shares kitchen on one floor between many units, and so it's intended that it's for people who are maybe a little bit younger, and they would be the primary activator of this part of the city. And I will end with the contemplation on the living with these two projects that take on slightly different scales, but somehow very similar. So these are actually models of two different projects. One is a project that we collaborated with Mini Living in thinking about a future way of living inside our city that maybe is post-object, post-architecture, and in a defining a different way of connecting with each other and with our environment. And this is a costume that we designed for Chicago Biennial that just took place last month for a group of musicians. And they would be, there were three wind instruments musicians and one vocalist that would wear this specifically designed costume. And the prompt was a little bit that, our environment is becoming much more related to our body scale as the field of depth is getting shallower and shallower, and our environment is becoming more and more unpredictable with pollution, seawater rise. Sometimes we can go to very far in the middle of nowhere. So this costume becomes almost kind of a personal architecture that the musicians can take them, and it becomes a filter of the environment and the self. So the two things did almost similar made a similar effect. One lives in the middle of the city and provides a living area for 3 people. In the middle of the day, it can be quite opaque, and at night it becomes completely revealing and transparent. The envelope is such that it filters the pollution in the cities and cleans the air by the filtration. And inside, there are 3 bedrooms that are just barely separated from each other visually. Sometimes it's with an elastic bungee net. So you can see from one space to the other in this very translucent and dream-like state. And similarly, the musicians would play. In Chicago, they played the music that we commissioned composer to specifically make the music for this. It's quite a somber music, and then they played this music in the conservatory in Chicago, in one of the most economically unstable areas, but in this very lush greenhouse environment. And then they slowly walk, sometimes bump into each other, and the pieces are designed based on the movement of the instruments. So the clothes also becomes the extension of what we do. By that, I'm going to hand the mic to Florian, who's going to talk about some more concrete things.
Yeah, and maybe Elias also wants to do a presentation in the end. We can do that. And maybe, so where Jing spoke about living and how do we live and what do we share, I'm going to show 3 projects that have to do with how do we make things, focusing on matter and also on labor, and maybe, you know, the projects were the projects AMALE already mentioned, so I'll show the Kukje project, a project in Hong Kong that nobody knows about, and the museum in Davis. But I think it's important to look at it through the lens of how it is made, or how do we make things, and what is involved, who produces our spaces. Kukje, the gallery in Seoul, is a contemporary arts space in a historic environment. It's the ubiquitous white cube. It's a cube, a white box that could be anywhere in the world, that needed to be nestled in this very beautiful historic setting. Not necessarily beautiful, but one of the few historic settings left in Seoul, near the palace where the emperor was, and this was basically the housing of the workers that worked in the palace. They were in the surroundings, and there's a number of these beautiful hanok homes around it. And so we took the white cube as a given, but we felt that this cube was too harsh and too disconnected, if you want, from where it needed to be. So when we went to present this scheme to our client, who is a very busy businesswoman, we decided to wrap it in a stocking that we had lying in the office, to in a way soften this edge, and in a way maybe create a sort of a permanent fog, if you want, around this sort of harsh box. We pushed out all the functional things like entry, mechanical, and stairs, and this created this sort of very undefined form. Here you see its context. The palace is here. These are the historic worker housing, the hanok homes, and here in the middle is the 3rd building. We also fixed the 1 and 2. And so we had no idea what it was, this mesh, but then we came across this armor, which is basically a way in which you can create very beautiful double curved surfaces that are also very strong. It's the maximum size that is made is on the scale of the body, so this is only a very small scale. And we decided to see, can we explore this, something that creates sort of this double curvature yet is strong for the scale of the building. And so we started to experiment first in the office with different scales. This on the left is the largest scale you can buy. These are laser cut in the office. And we started to understand also how does this geometry actually works? Why is it elastic? Why does it take on these double curvatures? Because it's actually all made out of stiff rings. It's just pure a metal thread. And we found that there's one direction in which it falls stiff and in the other that it becomes pliable. And we started to map sort of the building, and at the same time, once we had defined sort of the ring, the size that we wanted to use, we started to work with an engineer because we knew that this thing also needed to perform and hold an exterior. And so once we figured out the strength in one ring, we started to see how does that work actually on the full sort of wrapper of this building, and these different beautiful maps started to occur. And at some point, with the entire building actually figured out in the computer, every single ring was modeled, and we knew where the forces would run through the mesh. And then we said, are we going to translate this into Korean and have somebody make it, or should we make it ourselves? And we decided to make it ourselves together with Mike Ra from Front. And so what we did is we went to Alibaba.com. Yeah. And very quickly, we got a lot of people that were interested in this one area in China, Anping County. And we were bombarded with specifically one email and a Skype name called Ring, and she kept on Skyping with us for a while. And after a while, she sent us this. I said, that looks very promising, that looks very interesting. And so we decided to travel first to Beijing and drive for 6 hours and meet this person who only for us existed in the digital realm, and met her in reality. And I don't know how many of your friends have met online, but the first sort of physical meeting is always quite exciting. And so we came in Anping, and Anping is actually, for us, it was really incredibly fascinating to be there because it's a conglomeration of factories, basically, in sort of a grid setting, mostly dirt roads. There's no civic infrastructure. There's no schools. There's no universities. There's no city hall. There's no museum. There's nothing civic. It's just factories. It's just people making things. And we felt this is really the heart of sort of made in China. There was absolutely no civic life. The only place where we could stay was the brothel. And we stayed there for a couple of weeks. But first we met the brother of Ring, who was by himself sitting in the courtyard to the size of this stage. And what was he doing? He was welding our mesh together, one ring at a time. At that moment we had promised our busy client in Korea that we would deliver this mesh, and we were fully on the hook. And here Jing explains that the rings, the skin consists of 500,000 rings. Sometimes there's a confusion in counting. I think in China 10,000 and 100,000, something like that. So this guy is clearly wondering how many it really are. And Mike here, Mike says, what are we going to do? That's Ring, by the way. So Ring says, you know what, everybody in this town can weld. Why don't we come up with a way in which we can all participate? And so we actually sit together and we work there for a while and come up with a method where multiple people can work, concurrently at this mesh. And we all ended up working with 60 people, making 14 of these swaths, large stretches. We used the local car wash as sort of a place to clean and degrease. Here we do a check. Every single weld needed to be inspected. The local schoolyard was a place for a mock-up and a test. And after we got approval, we were able to ship them. And we actually worked with the gallery itself to ship the goods. There was nobody in between, sort of as a trading company, because they move things in crates around the world. So they brought the mesh to crude concrete structure there sitting in its historic context. And we worked with the ship and sailmaker to hang this sort of custom dress, if you want, around that crude geometry to sort of soften its edge. This is a particularly an image I like, where you see sort of this old traditional craft meeting this new, say, I don't know if it's digital craft, but it's certainly something that is derived through computation. But I think these two together and how they sort of resonate with one another, I think is interesting. We were able to make it seamless, so the 14 swaths were actually welded together in the same technique. So there's a continuous surface basically throughout the through the building, and the building itself never actually reads as an object, much more as sort of this thing that you can walk around but never fully actually grasp. There's places where you can get in between, up to the roof as sort of this thickened poché, places where you, as you enter the building, go through this threshold and you see a little bit the context there. And here, the relation between old and new. So that's one way of making things. And now, and maybe Jing, you have to correct me if I say things completely wrong. It's very interesting. We're all presenting each other's project. So we have in some way we don't necessarily know what we are. No, so this project is a project Jing has been working on. What? We work on everything together, yeah. Hong Kong. What is happening in Hong Kong, everybody maybe knows, West Kowloon, they're building a very big cultural center with a lot of commerce, a lot of different, just a new urban core. Probably people know about what's happening in West Kowloon. So the people in old sort of Kowloon, they got very nervous that there is a lot of development going on here, where this used to be sort of the main entry into Hong Kong. And here we were asked by a large collector who also is very much involved in the development of the city to help on a lot that they were developing, here, which is one of the largest sort of mixed-use developments. And so people probably know Hong Kong is incredibly dense, and there is a multitude of programs layered on top of one another, and most of these developments, they happen completely around malls and what have you. And so we were asked, while this building was already actually under construction, designed by KPF, this is the waterfront, to take 2 floors of this project on top of the podium under the residential, and to turn that into a place in which they could show an emerging art collection and also house traveling shows. And so, in some way, I would say this is one of the most complicated contexts to work in. It's also very interesting to think of your neighbors as things that are below and above you, not just sort of left and right of you. But this was, we sort of took the challenge, and I think what we decided to do is find an approach that in some way takes a distance, of course, from this very dense and commercial environment. At the same time, plays a little bit with this idea of the display, the showing, and in some way you could say is it lavish culture of Hong Kong. The envelope was incredibly tight, as it works, every square inch counts for real estate in Hong Kong. But what we tried to do, because this was one of the components of the project that didn't have to be commercially rented out, we started to push this facade and make it as thick in a way as possible, as sort of create a buffer between this context and the art itself. There is a part of a public plaza also. There's 2 parts of the museum, maybe it's easier to show here, with sort of a view corridor and plaza and landscape that we're also designing. And so we decided to use glass, not in its ability to be transparent, but actually in its ability to sort of filter out, to diffuse, and to reflect and to refract. And so we proposed to make a skin of glass tubes that are about a meter and a half in diameter and 9 meters tall. And in this way, there would be sort of the soft boundary between the very, dense urban commercial setting and this space for art and for contemplation and reflection. And while you look at it straight, it is transparent, and it creates sort of this boundary between the inside and the outside. And then there's areas, gallery spaces, where also you can look back onto the harbor. How do you make 9 meters tall glass? Here we again did not go to Alibaba.com. We actually went to Cricursa. Cricursa is a company in Spain that for 150 years have been bending glass. They were one of the first to do traditional shop windows in Europe. And it became clear that this is something that needs so much sort of expert knowledge that there's only very few people that can do this. There was a company in China that tried, is it North Star Glass? And then Cricursa, because of its 150 year of experience, was able to take this challenge, and this was the first sort of showing of their ability for the pitch to get this job to be able to make this 9 meter tall piece of glass. That's JING there. We did a mock-up. We worked with really a few of the most advanced people in the glass industry, including James O'Callaghan, who did a lot of work with Apple. And through that, we also ended up working with Sealy as an installer who works on all the Apple glass. And so if we compare now the little courtyard where the brother of Ring was welding his rings together to this glass facility where now 420 pieces of glass are being fabricated. And just think about labor, automation, tools of production. These two sheets, they first get bent into this curve. They need to be laminated. There's an interlayer in between, so it's double layered glass. The two radii, they need to fit exactly into one another. It's all specially developed tools specifically for this project. Large suction, so there's electrosuction cranes basically that handle everything automated. This is where they get cleaned before they get the lamination goes in, which is the second layer. They get sort of melted together with laser precision. Here you see the two coming together, and then they get placed in this special crate. Again inspected by JING, and then shipped to Hong Kong. So they're currently they're busy hanging these, and you should imagine this is on the waterfront on the 7th floor of this commercial podium. There's tornado, winds. So an incredibly complex process of installation that is currently going on. And here you see it under construction and should be finished the end of this year. So I will end with this project. In some way, maybe could speculate what can we do with these two different approaches if we try to make something here. Some of the same intelligence, and I think we only want to talk about sort of the way in which this materialized, these ideas became matter, so to say. This is a competition at UC Davis, the University of California, Davis, the Manetti Schrem Museum, and it was a design-build competition. And this is something that maybe as young architects you should start thinking about. It means that we were a subcontractor to the contractor. the money for this project came partially from a donor and partially from the UC system. And since they could not run the risk of this project going over budget, it was capped. There was a maximum budget, $25 million all in, including your fee. And it meant that what you presented there, you know, we as architects are very good at wowing, but in this case we had to wow, but at the same time we had to also guarantee that we could pay for it. And as an architect, you cannot take the risk, you cannot take a $25 million risk. And so you have to partner with somebody who's willing and able to take that risk, which is a builder. And so we partnered with a builder called Whiting Turner. They operate nationally in this country. And we also partnered with a firm out of San Francisco, what's a national firm, Bowling Chvinsky Jackson, as the architect of record. They have a lot of experience also with Apple. They did all the Apple stores before Norman Foster took over. And so we were this team that had to enter this competition. What was also interesting is that the competition, there was an interview process, and then there was a competition, but it was a quite long competition where there was quite some exchange, and where because what would win would be built, basically. I won't speak too much about the ideas behind the scheme, but what we wanted to do is work with sort of the essence of this site and of this landscape, not in a poetic and romantic way. UC Davis is the ag school, the agricultural school within the UC system. It's a very empowered student body. I don't know if people remember the pepper spray incident, but that happened at UC Davis, and in some way was where sort of the Occupy movement started. And so it's a very opinionated and very strong a student body who believe, because they focus on say, bioengineering, they focus on working with our world and the ability to actually tinker with our world. They have a very strong sense of agency. And so this spirit of being in control, or at least being able to sort of shape your own destiny, was something that we in some way gathered from the land and wanted to bring into the building. So we didn't want to create a very imposing building. We didn't want to create a very didactic building, but we wanted to create something very open, something that students could embrace and could create sort of their own narratives in. And at the same time, the climate, the environment, which is obviously something that we should all be concerned about, but is also specifically for this student body that works so much with the land. How can you make the environment also sort of a visceral experience in the building? So we had sort of this idea of the productive ground, and then an additional layer that would sort of highlight the idea of the environment. What we started to do, because also, well, there's a lot of things that go into it, and now I start to explain the whole project. In any case, the program was much smaller than the site. The site was 70,000 square foot, the building was only 35,000 square foot. Yet they needed a sort of a gesture. They wanted to have some sort of presence. It's at the edge of campus, and it was, how do you seduce a student population that normally doesn't go to a museum? How do you seduce them to come and enjoy and sort of experience art, for many for the first time? And so this idea of openness, we translated in this idea of a very open structure, a structure that just creates sort of specific spatial qualities, but not necessarily given by program. So this sort of tapestry, a variety of spaces, light, dark, open, closed, big and small, that could take on any program, any art that still needs to be produced, also for an audience that maybe doesn't exist yet. And then the program itself sort of found its way in this organization, just basically based on the qualities of the spaces. We ended up with the lobby sort of in the center, very transparent, open and connecting sort of back to the land, an area of art production and education towards the front, the offices and operation here, and outside courtyard, and then the gallery spaces over there. And this second layer, this layer that creates this experience of the landscape, was this grand canopy, the canopy that covers the entirety of the site and creates spaces both inside and outside. So during the competition, when we won, we actually proposed to cover the entire site with the same single perforated mesh. This was because we had to guarantee the budget. Our builder didn't want to take any risk. So he said, we'll just give you $40 a square foot for this single sheet of perforation, which would create a very even and very continuous shadow underneath. And we were interested in making actually the shadow and the light really part of the experience itself. And so we started to most of the annoyance of our boss, the builder, try to see if we could change basically and start working with that sort of flat perforated sheet and turn it into something else. Here you see a shadow of a tree which has different sharpness, sort of a sharp edge and a more blurry edge. And we tried to see, can we create something similar with the material infill? So the idea of layering started to evolve, and also this idea that you could, in some way, through orientation and spacing, play sort of with the shadows and the sharpness of the shade. And we settled on this idea of a triangular beam that basically spans the entirety of the primary structure. So it's both structural and it is the perforation, and it creates sort of this layering where the light basically bounces through these different layers of the mesh and makes it much lighter. It makes a much stronger sort of presence underneath. And then from the top, because this building is also visible from all around, it's very smooth, and it sort of emphasizes this layer that covers the entirety of the site. And what we then did is we, in order to create this variety, played with these three parameters, spacing, orientation, and openness. And as the sun sort of moves over it, you can imagine how this creates a sort of a different effect. In order to stick to the budget, we guaranteed with our builder how much we would maximum be spending on this, and we created a parametric model that allowed us to really finely sort of calibrate the spacing, the orientation, and the openness, while at the same time knowing exactly how much material we used, how many connections we had, and so forth. And so ultimately this gave this sort of map of that infill with areas, for instance, used for art display, more dense, and areas, say, that were sitting over mechanical part of the building, for instance, where you never could get really underneath, could be more generously spaced. And that was a way to actually, through information, really also control the budget. So while the steel was being installed, we went back and worked again with Mike Ra from Front, who also we work with on the mesh, to start fabricating these beams. First, we had to determine the spacing. That became also very important, because this is where the joints of the of these different stretches of the infill come together. 932 unique connections throughout the entire canopy. And we went back to the motherland and started to produce them all. Well, they were actually machine fabricated, but some of the components needed to be hand attached. And so 932 unique sections of beam, packed, shipped, and installed one by one. And what was interesting is that there was so much skepticism within the builder that they had allowed for, I think, 4 months or something to install these beams. And within 2 weeks, the entire canopy was installed, and only one of the 932 ones needed to be adjusted. And so in some way, I think for us it was a real lesson. If you want to in a sort of an environment in which it's harder and harder to actually control the execution, if you want to have some sort of say in it, it's really important that you also control the information and the ability to make things, so the lines of production, if you will. Here you see the building. It opened exactly, I think, a year ago. November last year was the opening, and in its relation to the landscape beyond the agricultural landscape, here the campus over here. And so the canopy sort of dips down towards the main access on campus. As you enter the campus, this is the main road in, and this is where the pedestrians sort of come from. It sort of reaches out to you. It's very low. It's 9.5 feet there, and so as you cross the street, it reaches out. But then you come under this canopy, and it raises up to 32 feet. And here you see suddenly all these decisions that you make in the computer being very legible and very present. And really, as you sort of enter this threshold of the canopy, suddenly you immerse yourself in this very dense sort of play of light and shadow. And something that is constantly changing right over time. The sun is incredibly present in Northern California. And so this really animates and actually creates sort of a completely different experience every time that you are there. The courtyard looking back through the lobby to the entry. And here the galleries, not organized in a very strict sequence, but much more the ability for the student to choose its own path, to create its own story, and always with moments opening up to the exterior, so that in some way you know sort of where you are in the world. That's it. Thank you. Are we going to do questions or what are we going to do? Yeah. Let's join. Sure. Should we get one more chair? This one also. Are you joining? Ah. Okay. What? It's okay. It's total confusion. Come on, join. Jing, I think you should join. Everybody's gonna get beer.
So thank you for really inspiring lecture, and I wanted, in particular, I couldn't have thought of or hoped for a better lecture for open house, and the kind of work and the presentation really answered some of the questions that were coming up earlier when we had the conversation with the prospective students about, what are the challenges for architecture today, or, what do architects do when, when they come out of here, and and it's so interesting to see, to see the kind of processes that you've kind of designed and engaged with, and the ways in which today we are, really kind of both kind of constantly zooming out and zooming in, collaborating, and mixing, the highest, scripting and the kind of parametric design with craft. And you were saying, it's this sort of sense of immaterial and highly material at the same time. The most sort of kind of sophisticated skin is, made in China, and exposing all of that sort of process is so kind of interesting, and I also think it's really, to think about practice and design and collaboration and a network of knowledge. I was thinking about a practice such as Front, with which Mike Raw and with whom you've collaborated, and how they've defined also a kind of mode of practice. They are sort of facade experts, let's say, but have brought that knowledge to a completely different level now.
And they're all architects.
And they're architects, and they're thinking about really, making and understanding how something that is sourced or made in China is going to be, different than if they're, working in Spain. And so it's just such an expanded sort of context, and you have to, and at times it's like Google, like Googling Alibaba, and so the creativity extends to so many different levels.
You're saying Googling is a creative act, right? Yeah.
It can be if you know how to search,
exactly.
and I think to kind of learn how to search, and because this came up earlier today, is like to learn how to, what is the question that you ask the search engine is more important than knowing the answer, right? Yeah. So that really, I think, came through in the talk, and I thought that was quite interesting. So
thank you.
How did you, or why did you decide to split it along the kind of living and matter?
You think it's a gender? It could be a gender, or
well, no, because you said you reversed it, so that gets you out of the gender thing.
Well, I think, let's see. As Jing said, we have very different ways sometimes of talking about certain things. There are sometimes, these lectures of two people where everybody says one sentence and they complete one another.
That's what we do.
Yeah. Also, Jing and I, we saw each other today for the first time in, 3 weeks or something, so we haven't really fully time to coordinate. But actually, I will also say that this lecture, we had a lecture before, which is actually called Order, Edge, Aura, and in some way takes us through these three realms that the book takes us through. But then recently we've been talking a little bit, if these are the ways in which you can organize matter, because basically we talk about, where do you put something and where do you put nothing, and you can put it in its organization, and then how do you situate that organization, and then what sort of presence does it create? That's the idea of that book. But we started to think a little bit to what end, right? To what end? And I think Jing was then pushed sort of this lecture into trying to figure out, what are the, how are we living today, and what is sort of the value set that we're actually trying to, put at work with this act of deciding where there is something and where there is nothing. And so we've been thinking a lot about, indeed, the way in which, say, our economic and material and environmental conditions affect, how we organize stuff. And I think these two areas, so, sharing and living and co-living, and like how do we socially relate, and this idea of labor in a certain way. So not necessarily, but the making, but also the the ability to make, and how do you make in different places, and what does that actually mean? Who are the people that are making it? So maybe a little bit more of a social angle, so to say. I think maybe Jing can say something about that too. But I mean that's sort of how we started to transform a little bit the conversation. Also because I think we got a little bit worried that architecture can end up only being a sort of a luxury. Like we don't want it to be a luxury project. As Jing is a communist. Elias.
You're a socialist.
Yeah, and Elias is born.
I said I was not a communist.
At the birthplace of democracy, and so sometimes we wonder, what do we do here, or how can we be ourselves within a certain reality? Yeah.
I also think that we started our office in 2008. It was a very unsettling time, and then the more we grow our practice, the more we're confronted with the, what actually happened after 2008. In Omaha, for example, in Made in China city, like in the factories that's producing these things, and so I mean, as politics getting more and more erratic, and technology becoming more and more unsettling for a lot of people politically, but also culturally. we had the intuition that it's important to go back to the fundamental questions of, just live and matter. If we're talking about the meaning of living, how do we interact with each other? What is that fundamental relationship? Sure, we can all have, if we move outside of city, we can all have big plot of land and, buy a kitchen, IKEA kitchen. Like, that's not even the question at this moment. So how do we want to live together as human beings is one of the fundamental questions that I think in time like this, it's really important to go back to. And also this kind of re-establishing a meaning with matters. Stuff, we can produce a lot of stuff, as you can see, anything these days. We don't even need people to produce very sophisticated things anymore. But at the end of the day, things have meaning, and how do we re-establish that relationship by the story of who's making it, what's the tradition, how did the technology evolve from the craft to the digital craft, and through that narrative, maybe we can regain this connection with the things we touch, with the things we decided to put here. So they're not just this, bought, sold, transactionary things.
No, and I think that really comes through in the work, and I was thinking about, your first, well, it probably wasn't the first, but the PS1 MoMA project is so, there's so much continuity in terms of setting the stage, right? So you're using architecture as a kind of creating a series of situations, of social interactions, of and this sense of engagement with the structure and kind of participation in a way continues throughout the work, and I think with the subsequent project that you showed today, there's always this architecture is kind of mobilizing a set of relationships and collaborations and a network of people, and especially for the gallery, it's the sense that the entire town becomes part of that. The kind of making of that project, and so that's a kind of expanded story of the project in itself. So I think that that's quite clear in terms of architecture's agency to kind of mobilize, and it's also interesting. I think we have been. I guess it's Alejandro Zerapolo that declared that the envelope was the last space of architectural kind of intervention in terms of, but I think he defined it as almost the sort of, okay, this is the kind of beauty stuff that you add on top, right? Like everything else is done, and the architect comes and does the kind of face of it all, or the brand of it all. But I think you're re-thickening that and kind of in terms of all of the making that goes in it, and bringing back the kind of social dimension, which I think is really quite interesting. So as it disappears and it gets blurred, it actually is getting thicker in terms of not only the effects, but the stories that are around its making.
Yeah, and in some way we also wanted to create it as a space of in-between, so that it's not just public and private, but there's sort of this space that nobody owns, if you want. Yeah.
Yeah. And so I was thinking, so Elias came in a little bit later, but you were part of the kind of practice, very early on, and I know you've been really working in the competition in Paris, and this kind of sense of the boundary in places like Athens is also really interesting, right? The kind of balcony and the sort of negotiation between inside and outside, which comes through actually in a way in the early projects of housing, right? You were already playing with this kind of inside and outside, even though it wasn't so immaterial. It was already quite present as an idea. And I was thinking about Athens and that negotiation, and Is that?
Yeah, yeah. I think, I don't know if people know the sort of prevalent typology in Athens, the well-known polykatekia, where it's also because of the climate that everyone has sort of an external space, their own space, a balcony. I think there, what is interesting is that sort of typology was generated through almost like sort of a development process, sort of legal kind of framework, sort of individual development of units. And so, and although I think that exterior space appears to sort of create a relationship with the city, I think often is not utilized. They're like actually very narrow. It's a section of the streets that are also kind of like awkward. So at the end, these spaces are there, but they're not sort of used as they were supposed to. And I think some of the projects now with the sort of thickened, in a way, edge, try to sort of rethink that kind of in-between space between the interior and the exterior. More directly, even in the project in Athens, where with the sort of flipping of the typology of the prevailing way of building on the lot, where that balcony becomes the facade, the circulation, but also sort of opens to that collective courtyard. In the Parisian, in the Paris project, there is a little bit different. There's not necessarily a balcony, or there's very small kind of balconies, but there, I think the thickening also relates a little bit with the city, and even with the sort of history of the city. I think what is interesting in that project is speaking also about the layering and the narratives, is an effort to try to kind of like bridge or connect many different histories, but also futures of the city. So on the one hand, the project sort of ties into the historical Osmanian city, and at the same time, with what Jing was saying, with sort of flexible proposal, kind of like foresees maybe or waits sort of like changes that will come to the city, and sort of trying again to connect the two.
It's interesting. I was thinking also in the lecture about what you spoke and what you didn't speak about. I mean, obviously, there's a lot of rethinking around the question of typology and materiality and experience, but we don't talk anymore about the diagram so much, and yet I think it's, you know, you still. You see
some traces.
We see traces of kind of diagrammatic thinking, even though it's not necessarily programmatic. I mean, even though it is experiential, or it is, but it's still the field. Yeah. And I was, you know, because it's true, we are in this moment where it's, you know, that composition has disappeared, and yet I think it's still there somehow. And I wanted to see, you know, how it evolved for you in your work. Or
I think it's fair to say that in our case, still the diagram is a tool, at least in design, to design, basically. Not indeed necessarily programmatic, if we start to think about maybe a generation before us that used program, you know, and the juxtaposition as programs, maybe to create maybe newness. I think we don't, and maybe this is the digital has in some way eradicated maybe function, right? Because now everything can happen anywhere, and anyway, everybody's on their phone, so it really doesn't matter what the function of a room is anymore, because the activity is actually taking place elsewhere. And so there, we do very much believe, though, that you need to find a way to generate variety, different types of experiences. So is there a sort of systematic way, or maybe even a diagrammatic way, to create variety, so to say, and various experiences? So I think it's fair, no, to say that for us, when we design very much still through a diagram, not necessarily through, say, vignette, or through scenery, or through mood, in that sense.
Right.
Yeah.
That's interesting. So the kind of the diagram, well, the diagram has moods, but not,
Yeah.
but you're not sequencing a kind of, it's not a kind of phenomenological like narrative or.
It's not prescriptive.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I think many times we start like a desire, I think, of a really strong diagram, and then there's a phase where we're trying really hard to erase, I think, the diagram.
Beyond it. Yeah.
Maybe the last question before I open it up is, one of our kind of core semesters here is the housing, and I do see that there's a kind of renewed interest generationally in the question of housing and social housing in particular, with some success. I mean, everybody thought it was dead, and yet today, I think between Tatiana Bilbao in Mexico or Michael Molson in Los Angeles, or you guys are working on housing. Hillary's working on housing with her practice Moss, and it's kind of like housing was dead and housing is back, and these notions of sameness and difference and field, and all these questions are coming together along with the sort of social dimension. Is that fair to say that it's something? Because I remember a few years ago you said, this is where we want to take the practice, and so are you finding that this is happening, or is it just a kind of few moments that are not adding up, or could it add up?
We might all have different response to this question, but I think the one thing for me that is what is happening, and I think where we enjoy in some way being part of, is if there is some sort of transition happening or some sort of new form is emerging, and if we can participate in that conversation. I think the idea of micro, and probably have had larger conversations around that topic already here, but I think it's one where we should also be very much thinking about, what does that, and I think that's what Jing was trying to talk about in the beginning of the project. Say the micro units we did here, the ones that and architects ended up constructing, was a very controversial conversation, right? It's like, how much square foot can we squeeze out of somebody's living space in order for it to be still markedly part of a marketable proposition. I think what we're realizing is that this is in some way, I think there is a need for higher densities. There is a need for less people, right, or more people on less in less area. But how do you establish them within these very small units, new type of or shared commons, so to say? But I think it's fair to say that I think this transformation is taking place. It's not necessarily driven by architects. It's maybe driven by developers and tech companies like WeLive or what have you. And I think we should also be careful that we don't get too. I think we need to be very conscious of what sort of role we play within that, and what sort of ways we have to also push back a little bit towards that. Right,
that makes sense. But at least design is brought into that. Moving beyond the notion that housing is just a number of units. To achieve that, you can actually contribute design thinking to living again, I think is a.
We did deliberately not try to do it in the US initially.
Right.
You know what I mean? So we went to Mexico and we went to France.
Where there's very strong traditions still of kind of social housing.
So I think that's another conversation to have, of course, right?
Well, I also think that we are particularly quite concerned with, not concerned, but I think we need to collectively as a society discuss this idea of the assistant, right? Like the AI, Google Assistant, Siri, they're all coming home and they're becoming smart home. And so the home is packaged into this new wave of hyper product, right? That's sold to us. And I feel like if we don't, we talk about housing as an urban thing and as a social topic as well. So if we don't talk about it as a society enough, as a foundation, to just bring up that the frequency of the discussion on how do we want to live, we're going to be kind of you know, too late in that discussion. You know, the package will be done and you know, handed to us before we can even contemplate and talk about what that space is before, you know, it gets
pushed on us.
Yeah.
The house as just something that gathers your information continuously.
Right.
Yeah.
I don't know if the younger generation students feel the same way. Maybe we're just
No,
old.
we should ask them. We should open it up.
Oh, I'll take two of them.
Yeah.
One question that's particularly interesting to me is that you bring a certain intensity to your focus on craft in each of your projects. If you come to a point where you don't have a solution, you continue to solve for a solution that works to complete your design. So my question starts at the beginning. How do you begin and nurture your design process through the entire project to come to a solution that meets both your initial and final goals?
I think an earlier version of this lecture was called To Be Determined. And it basically, and you already spoke a little bit about the sort of embrace of processes as part of the project itself, and that's why we'd like to show also these transformations in a way, if you want, from an initial impulse and then the effects of collaboration and new insight that then ultimately create sort of an outcome. So I think we don't know where we are going, basically, right? So in the beginning we have a certain idea or maybe a certain intuition, and then we just go down the path, and the path itself also determines the ultimate form. I do think we have some sense, and maybe that's based on experience or, actually, sometimes I explain it's very simple. There's only, if you're a cook and you're cooking, there's so many different ingredients, but as an architect, there's very few ingredients to pick from, right? It's like steel, concrete, glass, wood, but it's not like this wide array of things. And so very quickly you can already say, okay, this is going to the metal realm or to the concrete realm or to the glass or to a combination of these or wood, But I think it's not, I think our strength actually lies more in taking something that is quite a straightforward element and just working with that single material. So it's not so much very sophisticated materials or very complex things. It's really just, I think we have some sort of general material understanding. And since we are really interested in this process of translation from an idea into the making, I think, we spend a lot of time also just exploring how to make things. So it's a little bit of experience and intuition, I think, by now as well. Yeah. Yeah.
Sure.
In follow-up to that, how do you interact with your contractors in such a way that it seems to me that you're reclaiming a lot of the construction process, which is something we talk a lot about in architecture?
Yeah.
Can you speak more to your relationship with the contractor in production of your structures?
I think it's important to be super respectful to, most contractors love what they do, which is maybe different from what people think, or at least they have a knowledge in a material that you won't have. And so I think first being respectful and understanding what their knowledge is and using that impact, and but also showing that stuff, that you're not just somebody who just sits and has no control. I think the idea of being able to control the information, so where we spoke about with Dave, is really at that moment the contractor didn't know what we were doing anymore, and we just had to prove through the tools that we were in control. But I think the way we are set up, I think both contractors and architects are set up in some sort of adversary relationship. It's also how contracts are written. So I think you have a certain awareness of that, but I think very early on starting to work together is important. But recently we also have started to build like our own mock-ups, for instance, and really, actually get our hands a little bit more dirty to just show people how, we would like certain things to be done. So I think, you just need to go a little bit beyond the drawing and beyond the computer. And
I think, over there.
Yeah, thank you. In your projects, I was really impressed by the ambiguity of inside and outside, and the thickness of in-between spaces, and the discussion of territory in those poche spaces in your projects, especially the Korean Museum. And I find it really interesting that the facade or the edge is often used as a breakthrough point in your design, and all the materiality buries inside. And my question would be, why did you put net emphasis on the edge or the envelope? What does the envelope mean to you?
Elias. You answered the first edge question, so you answered the first edge question, so you have to.
Well, we have a book outside. That explains very well. No, I think in a way, and indeed, I think we spoke a lot about also organization and how we're interested in sort of organizing different relationships into the space. But the edge, in a way, is ultimately what defines the relationship of the space we are creating, right? The architectural space with the exterior, with the city, with the landscape, with the context, with the history. I think in that sense, I think this idea of also depth relates, and with the third chapter, with this aura, it's how these kind of like objects are perceived. And I think we are interested in creating not only organizations, but also, let's say, objects or forms or spaces that allow for this kind of openness, allow for to be interpreted, to be read, to be experienced in multiple different ways. I think maybe relates back with this conversation with the diagram. It's where I think also the diagram starts becoming more ambiguous and less of the sort of one-liner.
First of all, I just want to say that your work is amazing. And my question is, as a really young firm, do you have any advice on people that might be looking to open up their own firm in the near future after grad school?
I would never go to grad school.
Florian. We had we had an event. We had an event with the artist Ai Weiwei a month ago, and I think the conversation was about an hour and 15 minutes, and he literally spent the first half hour going, "Why are you in school? Like I was in school for 6 weeks and I was done." So, thank you for continuing.
I think, let's see, we all have different stories. For me, it was very good to work somewhere else and really learn. And I worked in a practice where there was an emphasis on making things, and that's where I learned how to make things. Yeah. So I would work somewhere first. I think there are people that start straight out of school, and it's the first, maybe, well, this is something actually we can maybe talk about a little bit in a broader context about sort of young and promising, and then what happens next. Because I think in the beginning, when people come out of school, there's an incredible skill set that you have. You're sort of the most advanced, so to say, because you're really, in the moment, so to say. You understand what is trending, if you want. And you're quite agile, and you're able to produce very quickly things that maybe resonate with our time. But they're all they're mediated, right? It's imagery, it's digital, but it is not a physical thing. And so you can maybe be promising very quickly or sort of stand out, within that field in the beginning. But the challenge is not so much the production of say that those projects that maybe resonate with our contemporary time, but the ability then to transform those things. I mean, we're interested in making physical space. We believe architecture is a physical activity, and it is something, you know, it's a tactile, it's something that you need to experience. So how to translate those images, those ideas, is something that's very hard to learn by yourself. And so maybe you can say, well, I really know what's going on, and you know, you can be sort of visually, you can produce really interesting things, and maybe you stand out. But then the challenge, I think, what we also see happening with, you know, you can say the same of our contemporaries, or maybe a generation that, you know, say in between us and you guys, that they're very strong. But then the next step, the follow through, that's something you can't really learn by yourself. So that's where I think just working somewhere and seeing how somebody else has dealt with it and does it is very useful. I mean, I think we all worked in different places, and it helps.
Thank you.
To go back to the first, response to the first question about not knowing where you're going, is that the sort of thinking you take when you start your practice? I guess all of these projects little insights into a larger goal, or is just the act of trying different things? Because we see a vast array of type of work and the way in working. So I was just wondering if you could speak to that, what sort of the sequence of projects mean for you guys, in the long run.
I think Jing, it's your turn.
Well, I think first of all, not knowing where you're going can be super productive as well. I mean, we started on that basis. You know, as Florian said, our first lecture title was "To Be Determined," and you know, the idea was that we had no idea where the architecture was going. And when we started in 2008, you know, I think 1/3 of architects lost jobs, and most of the office folded. And you know, when we were in your kind of age, then we were thinking, well, what do we do as a generation? There's no way forward. There was no one telling us, you know, this is the issue that we have to tackle, and this is the problem that we have to solve. So we just turned that as a productive question in itself. So in a way that I would say that it's, you know, project, it can be a way to guide you through this project from one place to the other. Just by doing things, I think it was very productive to us. The first project we did with PS1, we had only $70,000 budget, which is super small for something that needs to stand for entire summer. So, and we had this very ambitious goal to make something elastic. Which can only be made by hand. So we basically did it ourselves, and I think that gave us the confidence to do Kuche, which, you know, at that same moment we said, well, we built something like that, so we could just work with people and build something, you know, that's never been thought before. So one thing led to the other in a way. So, but we always had this idea that not knowing what's going to happen and not knowing what's the question we need to solve can also be productive just by doing it.
And I think maybe we all in some way grew up in very different contexts than where we are now, and we moved quite a bit around the world. And often we find ourselves in situations where we have no idea what to do, like from very early on. And I think you will be surprised how creative you become yourself if you don't know what to do. You know what I mean? Like, human beings are super inventive. And so I don't think you have to be afraid to go to a place where you have absolutely no idea what to do. I think you'll be surprised how inventive and how creative you actually are, and what are the things that you can come up with. So rather than trying to develop something that you're always certain about, like, what if you go always to a place where you have no idea what to do? Then, you know, you'll see suddenly sort of new ideas emerging, rather than sort of repeating things that, you know, already seem to give you the confidence that you know what they are. So I think especially at your age, you should go to the things that make you the least comfortable, where you have absolutely no way to figure out what to do, because you'll see that suddenly new ways start to emerge.
This is turning into more like a
help session,
like a self-help session. Actually, the reason we teach is to learn things from you guys. Yeah. You know, we are constantly wondering. also, you know, what's the new set of problems we need to solve, right? And I mean, being with in the school, I would say you learn from each other, you learn from your teacher, but we also learn from you and discussing and searching for things together. So if you're taking my studio next semester, we're going to be doing that.
You only have to buy the book first. Yeah.
Hi. Hi, my name is Thaddeus. Jing, I was pretty intrigued when you were talking about the housing projects you guys are doing beyond Mexico. And from the way you described it, it seemed that it was as much an ideological and political sort of game that you're playing, and not just a political one. And as to note of you insisting that we should have more conversations about housing, my mind just went to sort of not just the places where there have been strong architectural traditions of living in social housing, but places like Singapore, Japan, and certain parts of Russia where new types of housing are basically invented. And to do that, architects worked with a whole host of other experts, you know, sociologists, anthropologists, psychoanalysts. So my question to you is, in your mind, in this day and age, who are the experts? Who's your dream team you'd like to see sit on the same table and talk about this?
Well, with the Mexico project, we talked with actually the users, right? So, because the biggest question there is how to reverse the thinking of the typologies of housing that you're supposed to get when you don't have so much. I mean, the people who live in this housing, they buy them, but their income needs to be under a certain level to be able to qualify for that, you know, the loan. Basically, it's a form of social housing. So when you don't have so much, I mean, they have no disposable income to be, you know, to speak of. To decide where you live is a huge decision in your life. And then, you know, there is a narrative for the last 20 years of that kind of housing, and you should have a house that's on the ground, have a backyard and a front yard that you can add onto it. And to reverse that thinking is the biggest key of question in this project. So we actively just, you know, we had workshops with the city together, we hosted a workshop, talked with people, made many, many models to just interact with people, to kind of tell them, I mean, show them that there could be another value in a different kind of typological way of thinking. And in the Paris project, I think the developer was very important and instrumental in also talking with the city about the financial models, that we would only lease half of the site and give back to the city so that, you know, the site is given back into the economical life in the city. So in every situation is slightly different. I would say the key person we have to convince. I mean, that's why I went back to 140 years ago when housing was a very important discussion in the society. It was not only architects working on it, it was people who, you know, designed the parks, the people who were working with, you know, feminist issues and health issues. Everyone was talking about it. So in a way that if we were going to make a housing and a living at the center of our discussion as the kind of core of our discussion, so that there is a common understanding of where we want to be, we have to talk with all walks of life in all kinds of typological projects, and I think that's what we're trying to do. Also in different parts of the cities. Economical realities is different in different parts of the cities, different parts of the world. But I think indeed just through doing them and talking about them and involving as many people as possible around this discussion is what we're trying to do.
Maybe one last question.
Hi there. Thank you for a wonderful talk. I noticed that the majority of your projects are completed in white, or they're predominantly white. I was curious if you view white as sort of a neutral non-statement, or if it's more of an active element that you purposely engage each time, or sort of what the role of that element is in all of these various projects.
Should I say something?
I don't think the exteriors are white, right? Most of our buildings. Except the translucent ones. We
We like green also.
Yeah, we like, we have done pink buildings. I think colors.
No, but we can have a
long conversation about it.
No, first of all, I think color is very difficult. But also color is often applied, so color is then paint or something, and it becomes like a graphic thing. But so it doesn't have sort of a real meaning in itself, apart from being a signifier or like giving something. But it's often paint, right? Yeah, in some way it sounds maybe like a cliche to talk about honest materials, but you know, and white paint is also white paint, meaning the structure in California was painted white. But at the moment that you start painting it another color, right, it becomes suddenly it opens up a whole larger conversation, which is one where I don't think we necessarily have enough vocabulary yet to sort of speak to. But I will admit that I spent 8 years working for Mrs. White, Sana, and the white question also there came up many times. But in some way, I think the ability to reduce certain pieces of, say, information or things that you actually experience allow to highlight others, right? So at the moment that you start to use color in a certain way, it starts to really diminish certain other readings and sort of other experiences. So I think at this moment, mostly we are trying to develop more spatial and tactile experiences that are not necessarily sort of overwhelmed by color. I think color can be very, very strong. So, yeah.
But the white is also, I mean, it works towards the kind of ethereal, immaterial, slight abstraction. I think that it works towards that.
Yeah.
More for me, more than the kind of honesty. It's more kind of the ethereality of it, right?
Well, I think because many, at least at the projects we showed today, had indeed to do with qualities, because there are a lot of qualities about light and shadow and translucency, and then you know, white or gray is kind of like more neutral in order to kind of elevate and amplify these kind of qualities.
But we have made a pink building.
And a green installation.
Yeah. But I also think it's maybe still a terrain that we further need to explore. Meaning I think I'll take it as a challenge. Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you. It was wonderful.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.